Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this special meeting of the West Data School Board. Just want to thank everyone for taking time out this morning and to join us. As is our custom, we will now silence our microphones and recite the Pledge of Allegiance. Please begin. Thank you very much. That now leads us to our consent agenda and to Clerk Newbold. Clerk Newbold, do you have any updates or amendments you need to announce?
Yes, Chairman, Trustees, Dr. Reynolds. The only thing I have to add to the agenda under consent is the name of the Executive Director of the West Data Foundation is Carrie Davidson.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Mr. Chairman.
Trustee Smiley.
Is Ms. Davidson joining us today?
Trustees, she is not at this time. She will join us at a later meeting.
Point of order, Mr. Chairman. This is Trustee Newhoff.
Sure.
Did we approve the agenda?
No, we have not. We need to go into that first. We need to go into the consent agenda. Actually, we need to get a motion first before we start getting into it. Okay, so trustees, do you have any amendments or changes? Hearing none, do I have a motion for the consent agenda?
Mr. Chairman, I move the consent agenda as presented.
Thank you, Trustee Newhoff. Is there a second?
This is a second, Trustee Johnson.
Trustee Johnson, thank you very much. Is there any discussion on the consent agenda?
Mr. Chairman, I would just like to welcome Ms. Davidson to West Data and the foundation, and as a member of the board of the foundation, I look forward to working with her. Should we pass the consent agenda here? That's all.
Thank you very much. Is there any other discussion? Then all those who approve the consent agenda, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Thank you very much. And with Chairman, that is unanimous. That then brings us to the discussion portion of the agenda. And first up will be Mr. Gillen, who will be discussing the supplemental levy resolution. Mr. Gillen, you have the floor.
Chairman and trustees, good morning. What you have before you with this is a recommendation to rerun the supplemental levy. The resolution is essentially a roll with some date changes from the last time you saw the resolution. The resolution identifies $14 million annually at a rate based on current market conditions of $52.60. And so with that, we also have Chelsea Porter from Holly Troxell here to answer any specific questions about the resolution. But with that, I'll stand for any questions that you have.
Trustees, do you have any questions for Mr. Gillen?
Okay. Mr. Chairman.
Trustee Johnson, I think.
Yep, thank you.
Okay, thanks. Please.
This may or may not be for Jonathan, but one of my questions is, and it's not about approving the levy, it's about how we're going to communicate if we approve this to the voters and to the parents around putting this back up. So I was kind of curious what our plan is from that standpoint.
Thank you very much for that question. Mr. Gillen, do you want to respond, or do you know anyone who could?
Chairman, I think I would defer to Eric to start with how we would communicate it, and maybe discuss the communication plan, and then I can follow up on any other questions after that.
Yeah, I think that might be outside Mr. Gillen's wheelhouse. Eric, are you on? Mr. Eric?
Yeah, Chairman Kloppenstein, members of the board, Superintendent Reynolds, this is Eric. A few things. Obviously, we have a lot of electronic means and social media in order to do it, but we will also need to send another district-wide newsletter. I send one to all mailing addresses whenever we have an item on the ballot in order that all voters can be informed that there is an election. In particular on the kind of off dates that are set aside for school districts only. I feel like that's important in order to be transparent and let everybody know, because it's certainly easy to miss. It's not advertised in the same way that a primary or a general election is. And because of where we're at in the reopening stage, hopefully there'll be greater opportunities to get out and speak to some civic groups, which is normally something we would do. But of course, in the last go round, we weren't able to because no one was holding such meetings really. Not sure yet if I'll have those opportunities, but I hope to. So again, a lot of electronic communication, social media communication, information on our website, mailer to all voters. And I'll stand for any follow-up.
Mr. Chairman, a follow-up, please.
Trustee Johnson.
Yeah, Eric, I was more kind of curious around what our message will be. Specifically because we got voted down. And so I wanted to know what our message will be when we go back out for a second time this quickly.
Yeah, Trustee Johnson, I think the message will be around largely the steps we had to take in our budget in order to make the supplemental work. Obviously, largely what we did is we covered the costs with our rainy day fund. That's essentially a 2-year solution, at which point that fund will be exhausted. And then actual further genuine cuts were going to have to occur. There are some, however, anyways, in terms of not hiring some classified and certified positions.
Mr. Chairman, follow up. Eric, if we, in the message, I guess what I'm really wanting specifics on, and thank you, because that helps with the kind of general, which is what I was looking for too. I've heard various things around what we would have to cut if we don't get it approved, and knowing that the fund balance will run out in 2 years. I guess what I'm trying to get at is, are we going to put out something around potentially 9 school days could be cut, or are we going to leave it pretty open-ended that we'll have to make some cuts if it's not a pass?
Chairman Klopfenstein, Trustee Johnson, I will need to work on that a bit. My concern in some ways is that if you put out information that says here's what's going to be cut if this isn't approved at some point, at some point in the future those cuts become necessary, you do have to be careful that although you're not advocating a yes vote, you're advocating a yes vote by doing that. So it's a little bit of a tricky area. I will certainly want to get some of those possibilities in there, but if you do it with a bludgeon, then you can be accused that you're actually electioneering using taxpayer dollars.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and please, I was not encouraging that. Actually, it was exactly the opposite. I was just trying to get an idea of where we were going. But given that if the resolution doesn't pass a second time, I would think that's still an open-ended decision. So I was not encouraging that we put anything out specifically. I just knew that we had in the past, and so I wanted to know if we were planning on doing that again. But thank you, Eric, that helps.
Thank you. Are there any other questions on for Mr. Gillen?
Mr. Chairman.
Or on this measure? Yes, Trustee Smiley.
In response to Trustee Johnson's point, she makes a very good point that especially administrative staff and employees of the district, speaking in an official capacity, the law is pretty specific that we can't electioneer. Now, speaking as individuals to friends and neighbors, we are absolutely allowed to state our opinion, and especially as trustees, it is always appropriate that we say, here is the situation of the district, and this is the rationale why we voted yes to approve the levy. That's always appropriate and is always, we have the ability to explain why we voted yes. To come out and advocate and, say this is, vote yes on the bond, you can't do that, but you can absolutely explain why the resolution was passed and what the financial situation is. And we can explain in some detail. That's my understanding of the law. Eric, you can correct me if I don't have that right.
Chairman Klopfenstein, Trustee Smiley, I would concur.
And if I can just follow up, actually, one thing that when people have asked me, I often just say that all options are on the table. I mean, we obviously don't have, if we're not, there could be other options we have to choose later on. So it could be harsh, it could be muted, depending on savings, but we just don't know. Mr. Gillen, I did have one question for you on this. I was just curious, just looking at historically, was curious. So at $52.60 per 100,000 2 years ago, and maybe even the previous levy, is that a lower amount based on previous levies?
Chairman and trustees, just to clarify, that's the same dollar amount as the last one that you ran just a few months ago. So that was part of the conversation that we did have, is now we've gotten some new market rates, but really we can't apply those until certification happens. And then yes, the reduction as per a dollar amount continues to drop as our market rate continues to increase, right? So we have a bigger tax base than we did 2 years ago and 4 years ago.
Chairman Klopfenstein, if I could just add just a little bit of historic perspective. When this levy was first approved in 2012, its cost was $91 per 100,000. And now you've heard what the rate is. And as Mr. Gillen explained, that's a function of the amount is the same. So the numerator is staying the same and the denominator keeps getting bigger.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Trustees, do you have any other questions for Mr. Gillen?
Mr. Chairman.
Trustee Newhoff.
I have a couple of questions. One question I've been getting about this is what the actual net effect is going to be on people's taxes. And obviously, I mean, we've got two things we're dealing with here: the absolute dollar amount they're going to pay and what the rate is, which are two different things, because as the value of their homes go up, even if you lower the rate, the amount they pay can be the same. But we have a situation now where currently the supplemental levy would be off the tax rolls, and if we put it on, if it gets approved, then it would be on the tax rolls. And at the same time, we just approved a resolution pledging to decrease the levy rate, with the idea that the supplemental levy would pass. My question here is let's say the supplemental levy doesn't pass again in August. What's the effect on the actual total millage rate going to be?
Chairman and trustees, thank you for the question. We're still working on what that calculation would look like. Obviously, just in generalities, right? If you pull a levy off, our levy rate will go down. And so we're trying to factor that out. I'm working with Piper Sandler to figure out exactly how much the reduction will be. You've already, as a board, agreed to at least at a minimum the 65 cents. With growth in the market value, as we saw from Mr. McQuaid, the expectation is that reduction could be larger. In addition, with the loss of the supplemental levy, there will be a reduction in the levy rate as well. I don't have an exact number for you yet. We haven't ran all of those numbers, but I can get it to you at a later date once we've ran all that and I've got a chance to review it.
Okay, thank you. And my other question sort of piggybacks off what Trustee Johnson was getting at a little bit, but there's likely, in the midst of the lead up to the August 25th election, going to be some personnel changes with regards to our communications team. And I'm curious if there's a plan in place to ensure some continuity through those changes.
Chairman Klopfenstein, Trustee Newhoff, my plan is to have all of the communication efforts prepared and rolling so that when my replacement is on board, I am able to hand off essentially all the activities are being done, the materials that have been created. And I will also have the benefit that I'll be working closely with Lauren Windley on that as well, so that she has a strong understanding of all the communication efforts. She is pretty good at understanding those timelines and even contributing to them. So yeah, basically it just means that we have to hit the ground running and be prepared for that handoff, so that from the period from August 1 to the 25th, everything that needs to happen does.
Okay, thank you.
Are there any other
Mr.
trustees?
Chairman, this is
Trustee
Trustee
Ozuna? Please go ahead.
I have some concerns about whether or not keeping our fund balance whole is enough to get more yes votes from our voters. And I think it's fantastic that we were able to dip into the fund balance, but there may be people that think that that's exactly what that is for. Are we looking at funding other things with the levy that might be important to the voters that we could highlight?
Chairman and trustees, I can work through that question. So essentially, you'll see later on the agenda, we have an update on the fiscal year. So as of right now, I mean, we're pretty early on in the conversation. The assumption is that we'll be working through with the usage of fund balance. I'm sure there are other conversations we're going to have on things that we can obviously highlight that we do here at the district. But as of right now, what we're going to discuss a little later on, its impact is largely based on a fund balance impact.
Thanks. I do have some concerns on, like I said, on whether or not that will get us more yes votes there. I have a couple comments related to the communication strategy. I'm not sure if August will be a vote by mail again, but if it is, I hope that we are earlier with our communication strategy. I know that for me personally, my vote was mailed in weeks before I got that pamphlet. So I think being a little bit earlier on that will be helpful. And then I also think that if we have public support on the fall learning plan, that will also help us when it comes time to vote in August.
Chairman Klopfenstein, Trustee Ozuna, my understanding from a conversation with the county clerk is that the election, there will be polling places. So there will be in-person voting. Having said that, 90% of the people who requested an absentee ballot for the May election also requested it for August and November. So the large majority of those voters will get the same ballot mailed to their house.
Did that answer your question, Zuna? Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that, and thank you, Mr. Gillen, for your review.
Okay. Mr. Chairman,
Trustee Smiley.
I very much agree with Trustees Ozuna's concern. I think that it is important to get that material out in a timely fashion.
Thank you, Trustee Smiley. That then brings us into item number 2. So we'll move on to the draft learning plan for fall, and that would be led by Mr. Nesbitt. I do just want to note one thing, just to make sure I'm clear, or the discussion's clear, that we're talking about the draft, that will probably come back to us in a few weeks. So we'll be approving a final fall learning plan, because there will be adjustments when it goes out for patron review. But just want to let you know what we're reviewing today is the draft. So Mr. Nesbitt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, trustees, Dr. Reynolds. Yes, that's absolutely true. This is a draft of the plan. This draft, I think you've had a chance to read through the draft over the weekend. And it was developed from several sources. Our parent survey, we did focus groups that were very informative for us, that included teachers, principals, district support staff, parents, businesses, students, and elected officials. We've also received guidance from our public health officials, of course. And based on that, in this draft, if things would remain as they are, our plan would be to be open on August 27th. Now, part of the plan, as you know, we have quite a large team that's been working on this plan, and that team is divided into 10 subgroups with people that meet 2 to 3 times weekly and then report back every Tuesday to the large group. And so one of our groups is working on, and one of the main portions of our plan is to have a one-to-one computer initiative. So that what that means is we would be providing every student with the computer and internet access if they do not have internet access. Our current plan is that students in grades K through 2 will be issued iPads or a laptop, depending on what the needs are, and then students in grades 3 through 12 will be issued laptop computers. The reason that we're doing this is not only for the pandemic, but for where we're heading as a district in whole with our continuous improvement plan. So it fits right in, but this ups the timeline quite a bit for that. So planning for the unknown is part of our plan, and we've come up with, based on feedback from our focus groups actually, with the green, yellow, red possible scenarios. And so we have 3 scenarios that we're planning for. Green, of course, would be normal school operations, and what I mean by normal is it would be the new normal. That is, yes, we would be open, students would come to school every day, but we would have safety procedures in place. Most of those have been provided to us as suggestions by Central District Health, and so we'll be looking at all of those, and there's quite a list of those. We've had questions on transportation. Buses will run, and school lunches will be served also as far as nutrition. And both of those, transportation and nutrition, are part of the subcommittees, and they have plans for all 3 scenarios. But green is kind of green for go. So we would be back at school, and we would be adjusting and implementing our social distancing as much as possible, given the students that are at school at that time. We also have, from our survey and from the focus groups, we know that we'll have a portion of our population that has requested an online option. So we have the West Data Virtual Schoolhouse. We currently have a virtual schoolhouse that is specifically for credit recovery. We will expand that to offer a high school and a middle school and an elementary school online. And so our patrons who are wishing to have that option will be in place. So that is also part of our plan as far as opening in August. The yellow would be an alternative day schedule, and we developed what we call the yellow schedule as a contingency plan that would be an option to avoid complete school closure, and to give the board some options in that area. And what we would do in there, we would implement a physical distancing schedule where half of the students would be attending on alternate days. We would keep families on the same school schedule. So, for instance, if you were part of, we'd broken the students into two teams, Team 1 and Team 2. If you were on Team 1, you would attend school on Tuesday, Thursday, and every other Monday. And if you were on Team 2, you would attend on Wednesday and Friday and every other Monday. So since the week is an odd number, it creates that problem for us. So instead of having an alternating week, we only have one day that's alternating. And that was a suggestion that came from the focus groups. The red schedule of close, of course, we'd be in soft closure, and remote learning would be taking place. It would look quite different from what it did during the spring this year, because we would have the one-to-one devices in place for students, and we would be ready to immediately begin remote learning. We've had a lot of questions about athletics and extracurricular activities. And so we worked with the Idaho High School Athletic Association and the Southern Idaho Conference to develop plans for the activities and athletics in the fall. And those plans they have their summer plan in place. And again, they're a little bit on the waiting side to see where we're going to be exactly in the fall. And then, of course, as part of the draft of this plan, we have the guidelines provided by the government entities. The state of Idaho and the stages of reopening, will provide a link to that. We have the State Board of Education and a link there, and a link with Central District Health Department. So we do want to ask for feedback on this plan, and so we have a way as it goes out to get comments back, and we look forward to that. With that, I will stand for any questions, and we also have online for the meeting the leads of each one of the individual subcommittees that are part of the larger committee if I'm not able to answer your question. So with that, I'll stand for any questions, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nesbitt. And thank you very much for all the hard work you've done along with the team to put this together. Truly appreciate this. Trustees, do you have any questions for Mr. Nesbitt?
Mr. Chairman, this is Trustee Johnson. Maybe
Trustee Johnson, please.
It would be helpful for me if Dawn would just walk us through each one of the components of the document and kind of explain them first, because I think that might help answer some of the questions, and then I would reserve some questions for after that.
Just to be clear, so you're asking, I'm sorry, I'm confused. So you're asking to mean the red, yellow, green? Is that what you're looking at, or just?
I'm looking at the document that was sent out around fall reopening plan, and there's components around the red, yellow, green. There's components around the one-to-one. Yeah, I think some walking through it and kind of explaining, what's going to happen and how it's going to work and what the kind of overall plan would be a good starting point. I know we all read it, but we all interpret it in our own way. So I think it'd be good to hear from Dawn and the team what how they put it together and why what each component is going to do.
I understand. Okay. Mr. Nesbitt, is that clear for you?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman and Trustee Johnson. Yeah, I can add to this, and then anything that I don't cover, you're welcome to ask a question about. I'll start with our one-to-one computer initiative. We very much believe that in order to do remote learning and to meet the requirements of the access laws, that we need to be one-to-one for students. And when I say one-to-one, I mean one computer for every student, so that a student has something that becomes like instead of their 3-ring binder, their one-to-one device would be that binder, and they would take it with them. And basically what we're proposing is that binder, after talking with a lot of other school districts who have already done this, using some of their best practices, and one of their best practices that came about was, for instance, a student would keep it completely while they're at the school. In other words, if I receive a laptop in the 3rd grade, I would keep that laptop until I left that elementary school and went to a new school, or until I left the district. And that helps with breakage and ownership and all sorts of things. So students would have this. The way it would work is if we open on August 27th, our first day of school, obviously part of the professional development for teachers is that students would have lessons with this every day. It would become part of the learning process for the students, so that if we did have to go to a remote learning situation, for instance, in the red, the soft closure, that both students, teachers, and parents would know what to do, and we could have both live and recorded sessions with students. And so that's the big reason that we want to go one-to-one there. As we move down to the 3 possible scenarios, we move to the green, yellow, and red because it seemed to be more clear for our patrons to understand, as opposed to minimal or moderate spread of the virus. Since there really are no definitions that would help us to know when we would move from one scenario to the other, we came up with the green, yellow, and red. Green, the normal operations of a school. In other words, students would be driven to school by their parents. They would come on the bus. Lunches would be served depending on how the facility is at different schools. We didn't put a lot of things in here about that because our facilities are so different from high school down to elementary, and even our elementary schools have different facilities that they deal with. So the buildings would come up with a plan, and their plan would deal with how we could social distance as much as possible. So you'll see a list here: personal protective equipment, obviously hand sanitizing, and we would recommend masks or face shields, but we're not going to require that for students or staff. We would identify an isolation screening room in each school. Classroom, staff and students, one of the things we're going to recommend is that anything non-essential in the room is removed from the classroom. That would be if there are couches or things like that that are taking up space. We need the space to physical distance students as much as possible. Of course, hand washing, hand sanitizer, regular sanitation of the desks or other hard surfaces with our Victory sprayers. We would arrange desks to account for physical distancing. We would limit the use of shared materials and spaces. We would avoid outside food in the classroom. Office strategies and other non-instructional spaces, of course, the 6 feet distancing that everyone is pretty well used to now, regular sanitation and hand surfaces. Cafeteria, there would be regular hot lunch menu that would be available. And when we say that, we would have lunch. We have students that bring lunch. We might have to stagger lunch times to reduce occupants in the cafeteria. Alternative lunch locations, depending on the facility design. Of course, a lot of this, as I said before, depends on the facility. Options to eat outside when the weather permits. And hand sanitizer, of course, would be a big part of it, and self-service of prepackaged food items only. Visitors, we've talked about reducing the number of people that come into the building, so no unscheduled visitors. Limit visitors to parents and essential visitors on campus. Of course, we would continue to lock our exterior doors during school hours and develop parent pickup and drop-off procedures at each school that would allow for physical distancing or social distancing. Gatherings. So we discourage implement strategies to discourage gatherings in areas such as the bus lane, the restrooms, recess, hallways, lunch, before and after school. We would limit field trips, assemblies, other large gatherings if physical distancing cannot be achieved. So that's what green looks like. Our online option, we kind of put this in here because that is part of the regular start of school. Families, like we have, like I said, our virtual schoolhouse that we have right now. The curriculum department has developed a schedule of classes, a list of classes that students will be able to take at high school. It will not be the complete set of classes, of course, that you would take if you came to the traditional school, but there is quite an offering. Because we are so large, we'll be able to offer a pretty good online option for parents. Of course, the core will be there, the English, math, science, social studies, etc., all those things that are required by the state for graduation. Depending on numbers, of course, we may be able to offer honors and advanced placement versions of these courses. But that, of course, depends on enrollment in the virtual schoolhouse. But it will not be the full offering that we would offer, like I said, in the traditional school. So that would be for high school. For middle school, of course, the options are much less. We have over 237 elective options at the high school, and of course that narrows down to just a few at middle school. So we would definitely offer the core with a few elective options for students. And we have both of those lists pretty much completed. The curriculum department and the curriculum coordinators have done a great job developing those. And then, of course, the online option for elementary. The place that we're concerned, of course, is K2, and Mr. Myers is in the middle of a summer school pilot on how we would do that. And so those things are there, and that would be, of course, the elementary online option that we have at the school. The next part of the plan comes into the yellow or the alternative day schedule, and in a nutshell, students would be coming to school every other day. So if you're in elementary school, like I said, you'd be on a Tuesday, Thursday, or a Wednesday, Friday schedule, and then every other Monday you would be live at school. So the reason we developed this schedule again was as a contingency plan to avoid complete school closure. And obviously one of the things that we heard from parents during the remote learning time was they really missed the face-to-face time. So we're trying to develop a way where we could still have the face time with students, to where they would still have access to their teacher in a face-to-face manner every other day. Of course, at high school, where we're already on an every other day schedule, I guess the way we kind of jokingly put it is now you're on an every other day schedule. So even though you're at school every other day, one day would be an A day and the next day would be a B day. And then of course every other Monday. And then this would keep families so that every family is either in school or out of school on the same day, regardless of whether you're a 12th grader or a kindergartner. Because we did have a fair number of our families where the daycare provider was the older sibling. So, and then of course, if we're asked to close by the state board or the governor or our own school board, then we would go to the red schedule, and that schedule would be the one that is what we call a soft closure. And as we started out with the green schedule, and teachers were able to teach their students lessons and how to use the computer and things like that, our best scenario would be that school closes on a Tuesday and we begin remote learning that Wednesday. Now, the other part of the red, yellow, green would be that we may not have to close all schools. If we have an outbreak at one school, I've used this scenario before, it's 25 miles across the valley from Star Elementary to Silver Sage Elementary. And so if we had something happen at Star, that doesn't necessarily mean that we would have to close Silver Sage. So with these scenarios, we're trying to be in school as much as possible. We're trying to have as much face-to-face time with the teacher because we know that is the best learning environment for students. And so that's an overview of kind of what those would look like. And then activities and athletics. It comes down to what is the guidance going to be from the Idaho High School Athletic Association and the Southern Idaho Conference. In other words, we all in the Valley want to be on the same page. We don't want Caldwell doing something different than a West Ada school, and they certainly would not want us to be doing something different. So we're all going to be on the same page as far as the guidelines for those. And as soon as those come out, we'll be getting those to parents as fast as we can. And with that, I can go into more detail if you have a specific question, and I would be happy to do that.
Thank you, Trustee Johnson. Did that answer your question? Did you have other questions?
I do have some other questions, but I'd like to give other trustees an opportunity to go before I ask. Thank you.
Okay, then I'll call back, or I'll reach back to you after we cycle through everyone. Any other trustees with questions?
This is Trustee Ozuna, and I have several.
Please.
Thank you. I think one of my biggest questions is I'm hearing a lot of concerns from parents about what their students missed in the spring and whether or not they're ready for the fall and what that catch-up period looks like. Are we going to include any details around the assessment and bridging the achievement gap and how that's going to look as part of this plan?
Mr. Chairman, Trustee Ozuna, we have the fall learning targets, our fall ready learning targets, and of course part of the plan is to get those out to students. That would be that. It's kind of hard to determine how much should go out and when. One of the things that we did find from our focus groups, especially our parent focus groups, they say, you know, it was some of them said, well, we get too much information at once, and so we don't read it all. And then other parents said, you don't give us enough information at first. So our plan really is to put this out in sections, to get the main things out so they kind of have an idea of what it looks at. And then of course the fall ready targets that have been developed would be part of that, would probably come more towards August and would be a separate document as far as what we're looking at. But yes, so the answer is yes, we plan on getting those out to parents.
Okay, and Mr. Chairman, do you want me to continue on with my questions?
Please, yes.
Thank you. Another big component that I have heard, and I've heard this from parents as well as teachers, and I think we even saw it in our staff survey, but I believe it's probably fair to say that some of our teachers aren't prepared with the technology needed to do the remote learning. I saw that we're offering the professional development classes this summer, but are those required? And if they're not required, what are we doing to make sure that it's a requirement for all of our teachers to get proficient in the technology that we're going to be using?
Mr. Chairman, Trustee Ozuna, we've had the same conversation, and we have about 23% of our teachers who said that they didn't feel comfortable, you know, and then it kind of went down from there on that scale. So our plan is our PD over the summer. You know, we've put it out that, of course, if you don't feel comfortable with this, you need to take one of these classes. And then anybody who who is deemed to not be proficient at this, of course, August will be the time in those PD days where they won't have much choice. And so I think most of our teachers are realizing that this is not going away, you know, and so that number will be small, but we'll pick up anybody who hasn't taken the classes and is not proficient in August.
Would it be fair to say that it's an expectation then that you're holding for all of the teachers to get proficient there?
Mr. Chairman, Trustee Ozuna, yes, it's an expectation. That would be fair to say that.
Okay, thank you. What about the attendance policy? And this would be for staff and for students.
Mr. Chairman, Trustee Ozuna, we're going to have to be flexible with our attendance policy, and we're still waiting a little bit on the state to see how they're going to, what their guidelines for attendance will be. And whatever those guidelines are, we plan on meeting those. We would love to have, you know, be able to meet the requirements, especially in a remote learning. If we were in yellow or red schedules, we want to gain full attendance for that. As far as students being absent, I think we need to take a look at our whole attendance philosophy now that if since we're one-to-one, we have to rethink on when is the student actually absent. If they're able to complete remote learning assignments and things like that while they are absent, then are they absent at all? So we're going to have some flexibility with that, and it's going to be based a lot on what the state tells us our requirements are for attendance.
That makes sense. Thank you. I have some comments to consider about the way that the plan is written on the criteria to move between levels. One of the things in reading through this, you know, I would like some clear understanding of what the criteria is to move from green to yellow or yellow to red. And when you start reading through, you know, movement into yellow, there's a statement in there that says, if physical distancing requirements become more stringent, schools may go to an alternating schedule. And it's hard to know what more stringent is, and then schools may go to this schedule. And I understand so much of this is dependent upon, you know, the Central District Health or the CDC or what kind of guidelines come out. And there's at the bottom of that section, there's a statement kind of around that. I think it might be better to actually just bring that up front. If it's our expectation that we're looking for guidance to move us into the other levels, then I think we should just say that. And then moving into red, there's a statement in there about if there's statewide or local order to close all schools. I guess one question that I would have, you know, it went through several different steps in the spring, but I think at one point in time it was left up to the districts to decide. And I think we need to decide if there will be a point in time that we make that decision, or if we're really looking only to our partners to make that decision for us. But I would be a little bit more specific in that area.
Mr. Chairman, Trustee Ozuna, we would love to be more specific. We just don't have any of those specifics. Basically, what you said is true. We'd be happy to move that up farther in the document if you'd like. But it's going to be very situational, and as far as closing the district or moving the district, the whole district from green to yellow to red. Yeah, I don't have a lot of answers there at the moment.
But I think it's okay to say that if you're looking through this wondering when you might go to yellow and it says the physical distancing requirements become more stringent. I mean, that's really hard to understand what that means. And that means different things to different individuals. So I think you just open yourself up to a lot of questions with that statement. Anyway, just really a comment there. I have a lot of questions about the virtual schoolhouse. I think one of my first ones is how many students need to be enrolled for this to be a viable option? You stated that we already have it in place right now for credit recovery, but if we're adding a principal and we're moving teachers and we're supporting it for all grades, It seems like that's a lot of overhead costs. So how many students need to be at that school for this to work?
Mr. Chairman, Trustee Ozuna, obviously you have to have enough for a class, and then it goes up from there. As near as we can tell, we still have about 4,000 people that are looking at the online option, and we'll have a much harder number as we begin to register those students, which is registration was put on the just on the website, not advertised at all, and we already have people signing up for it. So as it's going to run a little bit like it does now with schools whose attendance varies quite a bit, and that is as students register, we get a good idea. But yeah, you have to have enough students to run a class, and so I think we'll be well over that number. But what that number actually is still a little bit arbitrary. I don't know if that
So when you
helps.
say, it does. When you say enough to run a class, I'm assuming for like a first grade class, you would need enough to fill a first grade class. But at the middle school level, do you need enough kids in every one of the content areas?
Mr. Chairman, Trustee Ozuna, yeah, that's the way it works. So elementary is a little easier to understand because it's like a teacher does all the subjects. But yes, that's why we've limited the options at high school, and then of course at middle school the options are already limited. But yes, you'd have to have enough kids that are taking English, you know. But if a student decides to go online, be an online student, they're going to take a full schedule of classes. So that student would be in English, math, social studies, you know, health, etc. And then yes, you'd have to have enough students in each one of those content areas to warrant a teacher.
Gotcha. And then, so I'm assuming that in the majority of the people that are looking at this option, that it's being driven related to COVID. So if a student were to start in the fall and then their situation changed, would they be academically ready to jump back into one of our brick and mortar schools? So like for the second semester, for example?
Mr. Chairman, Trustee Ozuna, hopefully they would be. Of course, we believe that online is an option, but it's not the best option. We believe face-to-face is the best option. So there may be some problems with that. The other problem, not so much with whether they're ready or not, but is that can we handle it? And so what we've talked about is using the transfer process that we have in place right now. And basically a student would be allowed to transfer only if there is room. And so we don't want this thing to be like you're in and out of online school and then brick and mortar and then back to online. Of course, I do believe that we need to prepare for students that will want to come back, you know, and that would be at either semester or at the end of the year. And I believe we'll also pick up some students that choose options outside of us that are part of our boundaries that we really wouldn't have a choice on whether to take back or not, since we're the public option.
Okay. I have one more question around that. The reason that I was first thinking that academically they may be behind is because on our website it states that the courses are not NCAA approved. And I'm just wondering what that might mean for like the student athletes, for example, that are pulling out for a semester just because of maybe health risks that, you know, impact a family member or something. How is that going to impact them going forward?
Mr. Chairman, Trustee Ozuna, of course, if a student athlete takes a class that's not NCAA approved, then it's not approved. That's something they would have to know going into that. You know, and we would make clear which courses are approved and which ones are not, just like we do now in the brick and mortar situation. So But that it comes down to, yeah, if they take a course that's not approved by the NCAA and they need that class, then of course it's going to affect them. So it's a big deal to make sure they understand that up front.
Yeah, so with the remote learning, is there an option for any kids that might be in this situation that they're vulnerable or have a vulnerable family member to do some type of remote learning that's not this option? Or is this really, this is the only option for the situation?
Well, this is our online option. Of course, excuse me, Mr. Chairman, Trustee Ozuna, this is our online option. You know, for students that want a full online experience and do not want to come to school. We will have certain populations of students that are going to require us to make accommodations to whatever plan it is, whether we're in green, yellow, or red. So for instance, we did have CTE students coming in to finish off certifications during the soft closure. We would have students that are on certain types of our special populations that would be on certain plans. And let's say we're in a yellow schedule, they may be at school every day. So we'll be able to be as flexible as we can, but it's going to be a little bit situational with that. If you have a student that wants to be at school and just can't be, that's different than a student who doesn't want to come to school and wants the online option.
Okay, thanks. I think that's what I was looking to hear, is that we do have a way for a student that wants to be at school but is vulnerable, that there'll be some accommodations around that. I think that's what I'm hearing from you. Mr. Chairman, I have some other questions, but I'll wait. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Any other trustees with questions?
Mr. Chairman.
And Trustee Smiley.
I want to follow up a little bit on this virtual schoolhouse. I have two questions. We've talked a lot about the aspects of the students. I want to talk about the aspect of the teachers. Number one, where are these teachers going to be located? Are they working from home? Is there going to be a special room in the various buildings? And how are these teachers going to be selected? Is it going to be voluntary, involuntary, based on seniority? You know, I just have 100 questions on how we're going to make this physically work. Where is that virtual schoolhouse located? Are we going to ask the teachers to come into a building? Are they doing it from home? How do we go about the selection process of finding these teachers, and who is supervising these teachers? I know we're talking about having a principal for the virtual schoolhouse. How is that physically going to be managed? It isn't clear to me at all.
Mr. Chairman, Trustee Smiley, you had several questions there. First of all, where is it located? Depending on the number of teachers, we have several options on where we would locate the virtual schoolhouse. There is a possibility that it could be work from home situation, but we do like the idea of having the teachers in a location where they can collaborate. So we have some options for that. And I don't think we've nailed down like a location exactly yet. So once we get a little clearer on how many students we're going to look at, then we'll be talking to people at those locations. How will they be selected? We'll post the jobs that are open. We already have from our staff survey a number of teachers, a pretty good percentage of our teachers that said they would be willing to teach online. And we would post that job and look at recommendations from their administrators on how they did during the remote learning and are they fitted for the online. And then supervision, of course. Supervision would come through if the online principal is approved. Then supervision would come through that. If not, then we would look at maybe the locations where they are. So there's different ideas for supervision and location, but really the selection process would be a somewhat of a normal selection process of posting a job, going through an interview and hiring the teacher for the virtual schoolhouse.
To follow up, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Nesbitt, my question comes down to, would you squeeze one part of the balloon, the other part puffs out, and so forth? We only have so many teachers, and we've already looked at how we're anticipating cutting 10 positions. So the only place where that's going to come from is our pool of teachers that are now in place. And right now, none of the teachers are really thinking real hard about next fall. They're taking classes, they are being with family, they're doing, the various things that teachers always do during those summer months. But somewhere around the end of July, teachers start getting really, really big knots in the pit of their stomach if they don't really have a really good idea of where their room is going to be and what they're going to be doing. Every year I came in way before the contract days, and I started putting up bulletin boards, and I started getting lessons put together, and I started getting copies made, and I started figuring out how I was going to arrange the room, figuring out how I was going to teach the curriculum, figuring out what resources I had, and so forth. And there is that, high level of activity. That's what teachers do. And I can't think of a worse possible feeling to have here comes the 1st of August, and I'm still guessing whether I'm going to be teaching in a virtual classroom, a real classroom, and so forth. And I realize a lot of it is because our hands are tied. We don't know what the situation is going to look like. But I think when we consider this virtual schoolhouse, having that pool of teachers set up at the best, earliest convenience, and figuring out how that filters out through the various buildings, because obviously if you have one building where 5 teachers say, yeah, I'd love to do the virtual schoolhouse, and another building where no teachers say, I want to do that virtual schoolhouse, that creates a real staffing problem. And have we thought that through?
Mr. Chairman, Trustee Smiley, of course we've thought that through. I'm not sure what your question is. You've stated a lot of scenarios that we're well aware of, and we would try to get this defined as quickly as possible. I think the thing that you missed there was that the number of students that would choose not choose us. Let's say it's 5% of our population. I don't think our budget can take that hit from a business standpoint. And the last thing we want to do is get into a situation where we're rifting teachers. So I understand this is kind of a new normal, and that we've moved up our registration timelines to try to figure out what that number is, and to move forward with all the things that you've mentioned, of course, are on our mind. And so the sooner we can get it done, the better. But you also mentioned some of the things we just don't know, and may not know until school starts. But a lot of it we can know way ahead of that. So that's our goal right now, is to make sure that we have those things in place as soon as possible.
Mr. Nesbitt, I really appreciate that. I realize that I'm bringing up stuff that there really isn't a clear answer. I think I'm reacting mainly to just the feeling that, I used to get in the pit of my stomach when the 1st of August rolled around. And I do appreciate that, sir. Thank you.
Yeah.
Trustee Newhoff, did you have any questions?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just first off, a couple of comments. This fall learning plan, obviously it's intrinsically really important. I think it's also an absolutely critical aspect of the previous thing we just discussed, which is the supplemental levy. I mean, I think if I were to guess what happened in the last supplemental levy election in part reflects some rather significant dissatisfaction with the way the spring played out. And I think that everything we can do in clearly communicating what could happen in the fall, what will happen, and the fact that we're preparing for things is going to help with our relationships with our patrons and our community. I'll make a brief comment about my colleagues brought up the virtual schoolhouse, and I'll discuss this a bit more in our next item. I think part of the reason we have so many questions about it is that this was never brought to the board. We've effectively created a new school here without an explanation to the board. I'm not opposed to it, but I mean, we're already taking applications for it. We're listing actually a physical address on the website, which happens to be Rebound at the moment. So I think part of the questions that the administration is getting today comes from the fact that suddenly this thing's been created and there's aspects of creating a new school that fall within the statutory charge of the board, and it's never been brought to us. And I'll just leave that there. But I want to get into a question about how we kind of getting back to some of the stuff Trustee Azuna was talking about, how we discuss the situation we're in now. I mean, the language in the document as we got it, you know, says that if the conditions are what they are now, that would be in green. And previous versions of this that we got, you know, went back to the minimum or minor or minimal community spread versus substantial community spread. And I appreciate Mr. Nesbitt's comments about the ambiguity of the guidance, and the guidance is going to change. But the reality is here, I mean, the previous versions of this we saw was that green was going to be no community spread and yellow was going to be minor to moderate community spread. And we're in minor to moderate community spread, but we're discussing it now as if we'd be in green under the current situation. And I wonder if we can sort of get that language out of this and say, look, there's going to be an evolving set of guidelines from both the feds and the state and the health district. We're going to have to see where we're at 2 months from now, or, you know, when this happens. I mean, do you understand where I'm coming from, Mr. Nesbitt?
Mr. Chairman, Trustee Newhoff, yeah, I absolutely do. We tried to take all the minimal to moderate language out just for that reason. You know, because, you know, one of the things we have heard is that the new normal is minimal to moderate. You know, and that's where the different colors came from. But yeah, we can work on that language. I certainly understand where you're coming from.
Yeah, because I mean, I'll note that our neighboring school district that had to put out its fall learning plan specifically tied their, what we're calling green, yellow, and red, they call category 1, 2, and 3, and they specifically tied it to levels of community spread. And their green, which is more or less like ours, is no community spread. So, I think we're going to have to sit there and think about that. Here's the, I mean, one question I have here is, let's say things tank in August. You know, people are out moving around, they start traveling around, and this thing takes off. The whole plan here is contingent on us being able to open up schools on August 27th. What if that doesn't happen?
Mr. Chairman, Trustee Newhoff, if that didn't happen, we have a plan for getting computers out to kids. You know, in other words, we would have the students rostered. So we would make sure that every student first off has a computer, has a hotspot, and then we would begin training students on how to do this. Obviously, we would rather do that face-to-face, but you can actually do it through recorded and live sessions on Teams, which would be our next best option. You know, so if we're in a situation where the worst case scenario that we're in a red soft closure, we would work it like we did handing out computers now. We have that process in place. So it would take a lot less time, but it would take us a couple days to make sure that students had their device, had it working, and were understanding kind of what was expected as far as receiving information and turning things in and grading and all that sort of thing.
Okay.
You know, so not the best case, but we would make the best out of a bad situation.
Yeah. So I guess it kind of piggybacks on the last question a little bit. I wonder if we can massage this document to just say that. You know, I mean, right now it just says, look, I mean, we're going to open up, and we all know, and I very much appreciate the fact that administration is considering a wide range of scenarios that are possible here. And I think we need to just make it clear to our constituents that these various contingencies are in there so that they don't think that this whole plan is going to go, you know, to some sort of disarray if we can't open on August 27th. The last comment, I just want to sort of echo some stuff that also Trustee Azuna said. The feedback I've been getting from patrons is that they want a lot of assurance out of this plan about the plans for the academic outcomes of their children, how to make up for what happened during the soft closure, how we're going to get kids back on track, how we're going to keep them on track. I think that's what our community is looking for, and I think that's the communications piece that we need to address here. In addition to what's going on, I think we have to speak to it at some level, or we're going to miss a serious opportunity and probably bring on some of the scenarios that the district is concerned about. And I don't know what, you know, I think that's part of hopefully the benefit of getting some more public input, and to seriously include the public input into what hopefully a more complete draft of this will be. So that's all I have, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I do want to go back to Trustee Johnson. She asked for some additional time. Trustee Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a couple comments and then a couple questions. So first, I think I wanted to just say thank you, because I think overall, when I kind of start to piece and part all this together, the components, the general components are all there. And so when I say that, I think of we're looking at what tools, technology tools, from a hardware standpoint, can we provide students? How are we going to reopen our buildings or manage our buildings through this? there's two other kind of components that I'm still not sure I've got a full comprehension of. That's around the educational delivery model, which I think is what Trustee Newhoff was just kind of referring to. And then how we're going to engage parents, students, and teachers, and what that's kind of full staff parent student development plan looks like. And so when I look at all of those components, I think communication and language are really important. And one of the things that I've been kind of mulling over as I've looked at this is we have to give people that high level overview of all of the different pieces and parts that are putting together our fall learning plan. What we looked at today, I've seen kind of titled two different things. It says fall reopening plan, which to me is a totally different piece of information than learning. So, and I think fall reopening plan is the right title, because what we're talking about really is how we're going to manage our buildings, how we're going to put tools, infrastructure in place, and then how we're going to provide an alternative around the virtual school. But we still haven't addressed, and I think this is what Dawn was referring to, is how we're actually going to deliver the education to students day to day, whether we're in red, green, or yellow, and then how we're going to engage students. And that is where between the yellow flipping back and forth and those two other engagement, communication, and delivery, that's where the majority of the questions I've been getting have been coming from. So I think whatever communication we put out for parent feedback on this, we have to be really clear. These things are not available yet. They will be part of our communication in the future, so that there's an expectation. What we're asking for folks to give us feedback on is specifically reopening plan, not necessarily the delivery. I don't know that that solves the questions coming in, but I want to create the right expectations, because I agree with Trustee Newhoff. I think a larger than 50% portion of the supplemental levy results were due to the spring and just kind of the experiences people were going through at that time. So I have a couple questions, Dawn, around what options besides every other day were considered for the yellow phase?
Mr. Chairman, Trustee Johnson, as far as looking at options for every other day, you know, there were different schedules that were looked at, but they were all every other day type things. And that is because the only way we could reduce the number of students, you know, at a school would be because of the size of ours, would be to half the students. We looked at schedules that some of the smaller districts were looking at, where 75% of the kids were coming and 25 weren't. And that really dealt around the total number of students that they had. And then most of those actually moved away from that, because once they tried to figure out the logistics of that, it was quite confusing for parents. And so we, you know, basically we based our numbers on the 50% on the fact that that's really the only way we could decrease the number of students at school and increase the physical distancing that would happen and still keep the kids in front of a teacher. And then as far as schedules we looked at several different schedules. The 4x4 schedule, which means they only take 4 classes at a time, and then they change a quarter. The pace to that schedule is fairly significant. We looked at, and also what it means is, you know, you'd only have 4 classes at a time, so certain classes wouldn't be offered. So a student might be in math in the first quarter and not have math again until the 4th quarter. So there were some significant cons with that schedule that we didn't like. There was also the 7-period day was considered. As we looked at that, you know, we thought about just going to a 7-period day for this time when we're in this mess, and then going back to the AB schedule. What that would do is we have 2,200 CTE students that actually travel. Obviously, it would take them out of one of their classes, and a lot of those classes in CTE especially, I'm just using that as one example, are pathway classes. And so if you miss a year in there, that takes you out of your cornerstone class or the class you have at the end. So as we looked at schedules, we decided to stay, with the AB schedule that we have for some of those reasons. And then the number of students, halving the students is actually the logistically the least disruptive as far as a parent and knowing when you're going to be in school and when you're not. I don't know if that answers, is that what you were asking?
Yeah, that answers what I was asking.
Okay, good.
I have like a quick question around, just clarification on Trustee Ozuna's question around how many students are needed to make a viable option. We talked about first grade classroom. Is that 30 or 25 or is it just a kind of our normal classroom standards for first grade or an elementary school grade, I guess, that we already have published in our policies, or is that a different number?
Mr. Chairman, Trustee Johnson, it could be a different, obviously we're going to start with those numbers. There's a little bit of ambiguity out there in the online world about how many students a teacher that teaches online could have. And of course, that number is really going to vary depending on whether you're high school or whether you're elementary. But where we are at this moment in time is that it would look similar to what it would look like for a teacher that's teaching in a brick and mortar.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, and a follow-up, and then for the middle and high school level, is it 30 students per class or and I'm using a number, right? But is it, what I'm trying to get at, is it the number of students per class? Each class has to have those number of students, or is it a total number that then they could take multiple classes from? Because what I'm concerned about is if, 100 students register, but that doesn't get us the number per class, what do we do, I guess? So it's just trying to get a clarification on what that number is at the middle and high school level, because there's such a larger variation of classes.
Mr. Chairman, Trustee Johnson, what you've just described is what drives administrators crazy right now in brick and mortar buildings. In other words, let's say I have a group of students who want to take a class and there are 40. Well, 40 is a bad number because it's too large for one class and it's too small for two classes. So we look at that point, we look at our FTE and we decide which one of those we're going to do. Or if it's a small number, we look at, are we going to offer it? And so those numbers, as far as elementary, we would look at total number of students. So elementary, you'd be somewhere around 30, but what if you had 35? Or, again, what if it would go to 40 students? Are we going to split that or are we not? And part of that's going to be a decision based on what our FTE looks like. And the same thing that a high school or a middle school principal would do right now in a brick and mortar building. At the high school level, of course, we're looking at 180 students, give or take. Some teachers have more than that, some have less than that, depending on how the schedule works out. But yeah, and then that total number has to go back to each class that's taught also. So it's not an either or thing, it's a both thing. So let's say I have 180 students, but I only have 20 of them that want to take a specific class that are part of that teacher's load. Then we would try to level those classes out, which is a lot easier to do online than it is in a brick and mortar building. But yes, we look at both of those, and I know this is kind of an arbitrary answer, but we start with what a normal number would look like, and then we deal with the actual numbers as they come to us.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So,
Trustee Johnson, I apologize if I can just jump in real quick. We're approaching 9 o'clock, an hour and a half in. I just want to make sure that I'm not pushing time for trustees that need to work. I apologize. If you could limit one more question, and then I'll reach out to Trustee Ozuna. And then if we need to, we can definitely follow up with a work session before we vote on the final plan. And I apologize for the lack of time. I just want to make sure that we meet the 2 o'clock or meet the 2-hour limit that we scheduled for this without any interruption.
Chairman Klopfenstein, this is
Trustee
Mary Ann. I just want to make sure you know that we cleared our calendars this morning, so we're happy to address as many questions as we possibly can.
I apologize. I know I was just making sure that if a trustee had work obligations, I just want to make sure that we're cognizant of that. So just with that in mind, if you wouldn't mind, Trustee Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me say I have a half hour more, and I think this is important enough that if we can't get through it, that we should do what you suggested, which is a work session, because I do have more than one question, but I will go with this last question, and actually it's more, it's actually more some feedback. So one of the things that we've linked in the document are the CDH, or Central District Health Guidelines, and also the State Board of Education guidelines. And in those State Board of Education guidelines for returning or reopening schools, there's some required minimum school protocols. And when I look at those lists, so those are in items 4 and items 5, we haven't addressed all of them yet in this reopening piece. And so if we're going to link those documents, I think we have to be really clear how we use them and how we're linking them together. It's the same thing, and I think Trustee Newhoff brought this up on the Central District Health documents, the difference between mild and moderate versus substantial spread. If we link to those and we don't use that language, then I think we're creating more confusion with our plan. So I have some concerns and questions about how we're going to address those, but I will save those for a later time.
Thank you very much, Trustee Johnson. I appreciate your consideration there. Trustee Ozuna?
I'll limit my follow-up as well. One thing on the virtual schoolhouse, it sounds like we have still a lot of questions, and so much of it depends on what type of enrollment we see for the fall. Will this be coming back to the board once we know kind of what those enrollment numbers look like?
Mr. Chairman, Trustee Ozuna, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, this is just a draft.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And I think a plan would be wise for us to then schedule a follow-up work session, just to make sure. It sounds like we have lots of questions. There's lots of new information, and do want to make sure it's in a public setting. So just want to make sure that if there's any short follow-up from the other trustees, we can answer that. Excellent. Thank you. Why don't we move forward then to item number 3 under discussion, which is revised policy 603.2, and that'll be presented by Mr. Heller.
Good morning, Chairman Klopfenstein, trustees, Dr. Reynolds. It's my pleasure to bring policy 603 2.0 back to you yet again for your consideration. I will tell you it's my sincere hope that this is the last time I bring this policy to you, as it will become Dr. Dustin Barrett's responsibility to bring it forward in the future. We've talked about this policy a few times this year. It seems like it comes up multiple times every school year. Specifically today, we are just looking at the addition of the graduation requirements for West Ada's virtual schoolhouse. As Mr. Nesbitt did talk about earlier, that has been primarily a credit recovery program for us. However, we are now hoping to expand that to be a K-12 online school. We do have a state school number already associated with virtual schoolhouse. So you'll see that the area in red is all of the graduation requirements for virtual schoolhouse for a student to actually graduate from that school. As an added piece for this policy change, we did strike the Renaissance 2019 grad requirements from the policy now, as those students have graduated. And so I would stand for any questions regarding either of those items on the change to the policy.
Thank you, Mr. Heller. Trustees, do you have any questions for Mr. Heller?
This is Trustee Ozuna.
Trustee Ozuna, please.
You know, I actually have a question. If you scroll down to the last page, this is not about the virtual schoolhouse, but I took the opportunity to just read through the entire policy again. And I'm wondering if we need to modify a couple of those sections, one on the college entrance exam and the section that's titled Assessment Graduation Requirements. Because I think given the situation last year, current juniors don't meet that requirement anymore.
So Trustee Ozuna, Chairman Klopfenstein, we did earlier in the closure, if you remember, did bring forward the changes we made, for example, to the citizenship or the civics exam that students had to take, that we used an alternate route for those students. So we did that earlier during the closure. The current juniors who would have taken the SAT, they will now take that in the fall. So the College Board and the state have work together to offer a opportunity in the fall that will be a school day for those current juniors to be seniors. They will take that in the fall so they can meet that graduation requirement. So that piece has been amended by the state to allow for that.
Thank you, Mr. Heller. I understand that, but it says by policy before the end of the student's 11th grade year. So I'm just wondering, again, if we just need to look at the wording here just to make sure that we're fine. I know that that's the intention, but it'd be great if our policy matched it.
Mr. Chairman.
Trustee Johnson.
Thank you. I actually have a question. I know Mr. Heller referred to this as being coming before the board multiple times, but is this the first time we've seen the virtual school language? Or am I missing, did I miss something? Sorry.
Chairman Klopfenstein, Trustee Johnson, no, you're not missing anything. This is the first time that this particular part of the policy has come forward. We did not have West Data Virtual Schoolhouse graduation requirements because Virtual Schoolhouse was primarily a credit recovery option. Students didn't graduate from that program. They still graduated from their traditional school they were enrolled in. So this is all new. This portion is new language that we are bringing forward for your consideration. Earlier in the year, we brought the policy forward a couple of times for some changes, but this is the first time for this portion of the policy.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I think just as feedback, to echo what Trustee Newhoff said, because it hasn't come before the board and we have some considerations, I kind of, just from a process standpoint, don't mind putting a policy in place. I just would like us to go through the process in the format with approving of the school and the whole structure first, and then the policies that need to be approved with it. So that's my feedback.
Thank you very much. Trustee Ozuna, you noted that there was a change you wanted to see, and we do have this as an action item. And if trustees would like to, we can table this, obviously, if it would be, unless it would be a timing issue, or we can possibly add language. If you would consider the language you'd like to have added, and then we can add that to the motion just for your consideration. Are there any other trustees with questions on this?
Mr. Chairman.
Trustee Newhoff.
Yeah, thank you. I kind of feel like we've got the cart before the horse a little bit here, and I understand what administration is doing, but I mean, the implication here is that this is something that already existed, but it sounds like we actually applied to have this be a recognized school and program, and that would have been nice had that, you know, we had a discussion before the board to create a new school. And the other thing that worries me about this policy in particular in terms of procedural matters is that the board has to approve curricular materials and per state code, and that has not come before the board yet. We're presupposing the existence of a suitable set of those by setting out graduation requirements for a school that we also didn't approve. I'm just wondering if we can take a step back here, as the chair suggested, we could table this and maybe actually have a discussion about the creation of the virtual schoolhouse, about what the curriculum is going to be, so that when we get to specific things like graduation requirements, that we can, you know, do those in good faith procedurally.
Thank you very much, Trustee Newhoff. Appreciate that. Dr. Reynolds, as far as timing goes, if we did table this today, what would be the implications for you and staff? Is that, does that work for you?
Chairman Newhoff, trustees, any delay just makes it a little bit harder to get things in place. It's so hard to believe it's already the middle of June, and as Trustee Smiley alluded to, the summer goes by very quickly. So, but we'll do the best we can.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions concerning this policy? Seeing none, then we'll move on to item number 4 with Mr. Gillen about the update on fiscal year 2021 budget. Mr. Gillen, you have the floor.
Good morning again, Chairman and trustees. I wanted to provide you just a quick update of how the budget's looking as we've started to work into the negotiations process and have TA'd certain items. And so you're going to see a lot of slides you've already seen with updates to them. So the goal was to be able to show you the changes from the last presentation that we had just last week, where we kind of covered the whole budget. I tried to identify some of the major changes to those and really what the impact will be on our fund balance. So kind of circling back on some conversations we had on an earlier agenda item. So what you're going to see is you've seen this slide a lot. And so what I wanted to do really was highlight the updates after some recent changes discussed with the negotiations process. So reduction in staff contract days, we're proposing removing that. Still utilizing again, because of the supplemental reductions, we're still going to utilize our stimulus funding. Reductions in proposed FTE from 15 to 10, and what the impact of that will be. Not incurring extended day contracts, not increasing insurance. We're still, again, looking at that course cost allocation, the Medicaid transfer in. Leadership premiums, this is an addition. So these are items that are identified within our negotiated agreement as dollar amounts that we'll try to work through funding. And so we wanted to make sure those got back into the budget. And all of that with these changes, what I tried to provide is what does an updated fund balance usage look like? And so again, this is the 11.355 million. This is just usage associated with the supplemental levy. I think when we start talking about fund balance, this is a worksheet that really kind of captures all of the changes, right? So again, we're kind of going back to an old faithful PowerPoint slide we've seen, and we're updating it. So what you start to see, right, is if we can talk about the fund balance deficit, we've already kind of had conversations of how we're going to utilize the fund balance from transportation, loss from the supplemental levy, and we get down to an amount of what our net anticipated fund balance loss would be, or where we plan on sitting all the way next year, June 30 of 2021. So again, right now, we're in June of 2020. We're trying to build a plan that essentially calculates where we think we're going to have for savings, and then we're trying to look and see where do we think we're going to end if everything goes the way we're planning again for June 30 of 2021. And so that's what this slide tries to tell you is our fund balance point. We're still trying to hit a beginning fund balance of right at 35 million. We anticipate a reduction of 13.6, and we anticipate hitting a number of around 21.45. And so why? So what are some of the things that we felt like we needed to make sure, and why the changes, right? It's really important for us, as you guys know, we've been talking about the fall learning plan. We've been talking about the needs of the districts and our teachers, and our focus really is on maintaining morale. And in addition to that, utilizing our fund balance funds, I feel like that we have been, our negotiating group really feels like that we have been working hard together to try to build that fund balance. So across the district, across our groups, we're building that fund balance, that rainy day fund, with the hope and expectation that we never have to use it. Well, this is a situation where it's raining. And so now we're looking at how we try to utilize those dollars strategically. Again, as part of our workload, things are going to change. Summer and fall, we're going to have PD sessions. We're going to be talking about one-to-one. We're going to be living with the impacts of the coronavirus all through next academic year. And so this allows us to recognize the teachers and all the important work that they're going to be doing. And when I say teachers, I also say teachers and staff, all of our people who are going to be doing important work to continue our efforts, not only in growing our students, maintaining academic achievement results, but also our efforts with high reliability schools. So additional items. When I talked during the budget presentation, I kind of walked through a couple of risks, right? I said we're kind of setting up, we're looking at what fund balance could be to start next year as part of working through that fund balance calculation. I'm running some projections of where we think savings are going to be, of where we think additional revenues are going to be. And anytime you're running a projection, there's always a little bit of risk associated with that. And so part of the things we talked about with the association, and all of us realized that those risks exist. And we said, well, let's talk if we don't meet our targets, right? So part of our fund balance reopener is essentially if we don't hit a beginning fund balance of 34 million, we're all going to have some discussion about what we can do to possibly help that and the impact that it has on the budget. And then we also talked during the year about what if we have an enrollment reduction, right? So we know there's that 3% in insurance, and we know that there's some ability for the state to kind of help us if we drop below 3%. But what about getting the 3%? That's $6.2 million. And so we started to have some discussions about, well, if enrollment doesn't hit targets and we start to reduce revenues by $1 million, which for us would be roughly around 10, 10 and a half, 11 sport units, kind of depends on the makeup of the students. Then we're starting to come back and talk about, okay, we're not making our budget. So really good conversations around the impacts of the projections that we're making, the decisions we're making. And really, I felt good conversation around how, if we don't make all of the numbers, what that means for us as a district and what that means for us for our fund balance, and whether that means we all need to come back together and start talking about what expenditures look like. And again, with all of these kind of additional items, our goal really is to try to minimize the downside risk of further eating into fund balance more than we'd projected. As part of the process and discussions with ISBA, they said, you know, what would really be helpful, and for full transparency, let's talk about the last publication you did. So this number, these are the numbers that you saw during the 9th presentation I gave, and this is what published in the paper on Friday. So I'm sure all of you went out and went to grab that out of the paper, and we're hoping it was in there. And then what I'm going to show you is what the publication would have looked like. And so part of the process, anytime you make a budget adjustment after the publication has happened, we want to acknowledge what those changes are, and then it becomes part of the proposal and part of the approved budget. And so I thought, let's practice this process, get used to how that works, since it is a little different for us than usual. So this is what the revised publication would look like. And here's identification of the major changes between the board meeting we had on the 9th and the board meeting on the 15th. And so what will happen on the 23rd, if presumably we don't have any more changes, we'll identify these. I'll identify these as part of the presentation on the 23rd, should you be willing to approve the budget as presented. And with that, I can stand for any questions you have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gillen. Are there any questions for Mr. McGillen from trustees?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, this is Trustee Johnson.
Trustee Johnson, please.
Thanks, Jonathan. There's just one quick question, and I'm linking now 3 things together. So I saw in the kind of negotiation information that if the supplemental levy passes, there was a kind of a trigger to potentially reopen the negotiations that was requested. And then I see kind of the why in this slide presentation. And then I think about our fall readiness and learning as well as devices. And what I'm missing out of the why is, and I read the staff survey and some of the comments, and a lot of the comments echoed exactly what parents said, which is how do we get parents engaged and how do we make sure teachers and students and parents are all trained? And what I'm missing out of the why there is, I see we got the 2 extra days, but I don't see where in the why, because we're asking teachers to do more, how we're actually gonna do that. Like, are we gonna ask them to do some extra days use those 2 days for actual training and education, or what? I'm trying to understand. I'm trying to link those things together, because my concern is that we're asking teachers to do more, but we don't know exactly what we're expecting of them. And I'm trying to create the story that says, here's how we're using the money and why we're more, and create value for everybody in the system, which says we're going to use this to help train teachers to be better. And they've asked for this, so that's why we're using more of our fund balance, and that's why we're adding these 2 days. And I just can't get that story linked. Can you help me with that?
Chairman and trustees, thank you, Trustee Johnson, for the question. That's a good one. And I think it's one we're still working through. So as you look through the changes, right, you're going to start to see that we talked about more professional development. Obviously, taking a reduction in days is not going to help us do that. But I think what you're also talking about is, what are we doing in the summer to get prepared? And we have some items identified for that. We have some projects we're looking into. And things we're going to do, and I just have not had to be able to put that into part of what our plan looks like and how we utilize our dollars. So I think there's still some more, I guess, information to come as we kind of look at, once the budget kind of settles, right? We've settled on a number and we kind of know what our resources are going to look like. Then we're going to start looking at, okay, how do we maximize our dollars? And so I do think there's still more information to come on how we're going to use our money. Right now, it's very difficult to try to say, here's we want to do maybe over the summer, and do we have days, or do we have dollars available in different budget pockets that haven't been reduced, if we actually haven't finalized our budget, right? And so then I can start going to work on how we maximize the dollars we do have, and how we use that to make sure we meet the fall learning plan. So I think with that, there'll continue to be information that will keep coming out as we use our money, as we try to link all that together. Does that help?
It does. Thank you, Jonathan. And Mr. Chairman, just one other comment. On June 10th, the State Board of Education actually put out a request for $34 million of CARES Act funding to help with the device, one-to-one device purchasing and internet connectivity access. So I just wanted that on there. And I think, Jonathan, you're probably aware of that. But as we go through the budget hearing next week, or the budget information, I just wanted to kind of understand what we would do if that does come into fruition. So I'll just put that out for next week.
Chairman and trustees, yes, I've been following that conversation quite a lot, right? Because that'll just lessen a burden and allow us to maximize our dollars in other ways.
Thank you very much. Do any other trustees have questions for Mr. Dillon?
This is Trustee Ozuna. I have a couple comments. I do want to acknowledge and recognize how far we've come with negotiations over the past few years. And I appreciate and want to thank everyone that was part of this process and getting us to where we're at. I do believe that we'll be asking more from our teachers this fall. And, I think that what they're requesting is fair in that. That said, this shifts more of the supplemental levy amount to the fund balance. And going back to my comments earlier around the supplemental levy, I do think that it would help us if we looked at some other things that we could fund in our communication around the supplemental levy to help us with that. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those comments. Any other trustees? Thank you very much. Then we will move. Excuse me. We move on to the action portion of the agenda. And first up is the supplemental levy resolution. And do I have a motion?
Mr. Chairman.
Trustee Smiley.
I would move that we approve the supplemental levy resolution.
Thank you very much for that motion. Is there a second?
I would second.
Trustee Ozuna with your second. Thank you very much. Is there any discussion?
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate that in the language that it clearly states that this is simply the continuation of an existing levy, because in the previous one that wasn't completely clear, and I think that anything we can do to point out to the voters that this isn't $50 of new money necessarily. It's simply continuing an existing levy. And I think it's up for us to communicate that as a school district, we don't really have any other tools. The actions of the legislature in 2006 very much limited the hands of the school district. The overwhelming majority of school districts in Idaho have to rely on these supplemental levies. Just leaving it at that.
Thank you very much for that comment. Are there any other comments from trustees?
Mr. Chairman.
Trustee Johnson, excuse me.
It's okay. Thank you. I want to just say, I support everything we're trying to do around funding and management of the budget and trying to maximize our dollars. I think where I'm struggling with kind of where I'm going to land is around the fact that we have some ability, just like I think the patrons will be, we have a fund balance, and also we don't have a plan. I think Trustee Newhoff had asked for this last time, and we don't have it yet, around how do we kind of get off of our reliance on the supplemental levy? What's our kind of strategy there? So I'm struggling with kind of knowing the value of education and being a huge supporter of that and wanting to make sure that every dollar is available that can be. I also am struggling with, where people are at today in the economy and how we kind of plan for helping our patrons as well as our education system. And so I just want to kind of put that comment on record.
Thank you. Are there any other trustees before we go to vote? Then all those in favor, please say aye.
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 And Chairman is aye as well, so it passes unanimous. Thank you very much. That brings us to item number 2, the fall learning plan. And again, we're voting on the draft, so this is not the final. Just want to make sure it's understood, but we'll entertain a motion.
Mr. Chairman.
Trustee Newhoff.
Yeah, I move that we table board approval of even a draft fall learning plan for time certain until time which that the district can publish and advertise the plan and seek patron feedback that would lead to an actual draft that we would approve, or an actual plan that we would approve.
Thank you very much for that motion. Is there a second?
A clarification question on the motion?
Please.
Sure.
Trustee Newhoff, would you be proposing that the draft that we saw today with maybe some modifications is what's provided to patrons to get feedback on?
Yes.
Okay, thank you for that.
Point of clarification, Mr. Chairman.
Please.
Are we looking at a draft fall learning plan or a draft fall reopening plan? Because the document that we got is titled draft fall reopening plan, and then on the agenda item, it's a draft fall learning plan.
Well, actually, it would be the draft fall learning plan that's on the agenda. That's what we'll go.
I'd be happy to address Trustee Johnson's question with my intent. I mean, I think that's that title could be one component that would be subject to comment and perhaps editing prior to board approval.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is there a second on this motion?
This is Trustee Ozuna with a second.
Thank you very much for that second, Trustee Ozuna. Is there any further discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor, please say aye.
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 Chairman be aye as well, so it makes it unanimous. That brings us then to item number 3, revised policy 603.2. Is there a motion?
Mr. Chairman.
Trustee Newhoff.
Yeah, I move that we table consideration of revised policy 603.2 2.0 high school credits and graduation, until which time that we can have a discussion, an open session regarding the nature and creation of the virtual schoolhouse and its curriculum.
Thank you for that motion. Is there a second?
Second. Trustee Johnson. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Trustee Johnson with the second. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor, please say aye.
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 I'm sorry, Trustee Johnson or Trustee Ozuna? I couldn't quite hear.
Both, I think.
I'm an aye.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. And Chairman is aye as well, so it makes it unanimous. That brings us to the adjournment. Do I have a motion?
Mr. Chairman, I move we adjourn.
Thank you very much for that motion, Trustee Smiley. Is there a second?
Second, Trustee Johnson.
Trustee Johnson with the second. Any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor, please say aye.
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 And Chairman is aye as well. So thank you very much. I appreciate the morning, and we will work on getting a workshop together so we can discuss it in more detail. Thank you very much. Have a good morning.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.